Hello, I'm Robert, and helping you if you're scared of many things, and by fact checking. And this is about Pelosi landing in Taiwan, and there's nothing to be scared of. She landed there safely. There's a photo that she herself tweeted when she got there on Taiwan. And her delegation is there to show America's unwavering commitment to supporting Taiwan's vibrant democracy. So they're affirming their support for Taiwan. But they are not they're not doing anything against the one China policy by which they require they're not saying anything to support Taiwanese independence, which is the thing that the Chinese are concerned about. And this makes no difference to US policy, and it's really there's not even the first speaker to go to Taiwan. Newt Gingrich was he visited China in 1997, and he talked about how back then the Chinese Communist Party, they were dancing around and just like today, they were dancing around and making threats, and he thinks that they will calm down once Nancy Pelosi has been to Taiwan and left and done her thing, just as they did when he visited back then. And actually, although China does so many threats over and over again, it does lots of large military exercises, lots of fighting words, but it is by far the least militant of all the great powers in this century. It's had no wars this century, whereas US and Russia fought many wars, and so have other countries. And in fact, if you look at the youngest sailor in China who's seen active combat, it would be 52. Would have been 18 when they captured one small uninhabited island from Vietnam in 1988. And the youngest Chinese soldier who has seen active duty in combat, then he would be 52. And he would be 61 today, after a short war of 3 weeks and 6 days, when they captured a city of 200,000 in Vietnam, and then they retreated, and they didn't keep it for long. And that's it. That's their entire history of combat that they've got. So there's the interview with Newt Gingrich in recent times. He talked about all the big fuss that they had back then, and he was asked hypothetically what would happen if China shot down Pelosi's plane. Then US would respond with massive sanctions. It wouldn't respond with a military anything. It's got Japan. He mentions Japan, Australia, as the United States itself. It's got many partners that would immediately impose sanctions on China if it did something like that. And there'd be many things they could do that would show their displeasure in a very harmful way to China, and China would then have to toe its line and apologise. And so what is China going to do? Well, it'll do exercises, it'll do live fire. Now, some of you panic about live fire. Live fire just means firing missiles into the sea in this particular context. Which, like for instance, I'm in Scotland, and there's a artillery range on the Outer Hebrides, where they fire missiles into the Atlantic. Totally pointless. There's not firing at anything. It's just testing their missiles, make sure they're working, and that everybody knows how to fire them. So that's all China's probably going to do. And then it might cross the midpoint between Taiwan and China, and it could fly planes into the aircraft ADIS, I should say. That's me. I'm maybe slightly what's the word? You know the word, dyslexic. I sometimes swap letters around. ADIS. It's Aerial Identification Zone. Got it spelled right there. And so Taiwan also doesn't have nukes. It's signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty while it was. So the history is that the United States originally and the United Nations originally recognized Taiwan as the exiled government of China. Then, while it was doing that, then Taiwan signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But now it recognized China as the legitimate government of China. The PLA, the Communist Party's legitimate government of China. And Taiwan wants to be independent now, the current government. It no longer lays claim to China. But China is still back in the days of thinking, well, this is the old government of China that we pushed out to Taiwan, and so we don't want it to be independent. And so that's basically what all the fuss is about. We don't want to be an independent country because it used to be the government in China before the Cultural Revolution. So that's what all the fuss is about. And so Taiwan doesn't have nukes, and in any case it would make absolutely no sense for, I've already showed you this picture, it would really make no sense for China, but it's never going to drop nukes on Taiwan, because China tells the world that Taiwan is already part of China, and it claims to its own people that it's just got a local government that isn't really following the Chinese direction, and that it just doesn't understand China very well, and if its people only understood all the value of Chinese communism, then they would want to be part of China, and it's just an education thing that is needed to convert Taiwan to refold it back to be part of China. That's what China claims to its own people. And to the rest of the world, it claims that Taiwan is still part of China and is eventually going to be part of it. And it claims that it could invade Taiwan and take it over in just a few days, but it's very peacefully not doing that. That's the image that China presents to the world. So if it were to drop nukes on Taiwan, I mean, anyway, it's got lots of ethnic Chinese in Taiwan, and it would be a major, major war crime. And same as shooting down Pelosi's plane would be a major war crime too, because Pelosi is not a combatant in any war. It's not even targeting U.S. military, because she's not a general and she's not a soldier, and she wouldn't be a target even in a war. So it's a major war crime to target someone like that. So they're not going to do that. And China cares about soft power. It cares about its reputation. And it has a somewhat exaggerated idea, according to other people from other parties, other countries, about it thinks that we all look up to China, and because of its past Taoism and because of its strength and so on, and its economy and all things it's achieved. And so that's what it's projecting in the world. It's very different from Russia, which doesn't really care much what the rest of the world thinks about its own economic achievements or its own cultural achievements. It's just it's more involved in bullying and trying to get its way in that way. China is not like that. It does do commercial, trying to get an edge on other countries, and sometimes its methods to do that other countries may say is unethical. It does have internally it's got human rights issues with the ethnic minorities, the countries that it captured during the Cultural Revolution and after it, and some that it treats quite badly. So, but it's not trying to bully any other countries in the way that Russia is, and it cares about its image in the world very greatly, far more than we probably realise. It's got this great idea, it's got a rather exaggerated idea. Most countries are like that. France have a very strong idea about how much they are understood in the rest of the world, about how other countries look up to them. UK, I mean, we have our old empire, and people of the rest of the world, we think the rest of the world looks up to us, and the United States thinks everyone looks up to them, and the Indians do, and the Japanese do, of course. They think that other countries greatly look up to the Japanese, and so on. So every country has a somewhat exaggerated idea of its own importance to the rest of the world, and China is like that, and they're especially focused on soft power. So showing how peaceful they are, how strong they are, showing that they have such a great system of government and so on, according to their own lights. So the last thing they would want to do is to do some really major war crime, to start a war with Taiwan. And then if China were to fight with Taiwan and not nuclear war, that's just makes no sense. And there's no way the United States would respond to anything with nukes against China. That makes no sense either. It's not a risk of anything like that. It's not something that could escalate to a nuclear war either. It makes no sense. And so suppose there was a war, which is, as we'll see, is quite impossible. Pelosi is very well protected, by the way. That's a Carrier Strike Force group, Carrier Strike Group 5, which is in the Chinese region already, and they didn't need to move them into that area. And there's a big destroyer and lots of planes and other fast boats and things, keeping a discreet eye on her in the distance as she flew there in a military plane. So she's very well protected. There's now, yes, so look at this. It's just beyond credible. So we're talking about something that would be more than 10 times as many people as for D-Day in the United Kingdom. D-Day at end World War II. 2.5 million would be needed to invade Taiwan with the 5-to-1 ratio, and be more than that, 5 million if they brought in all their reservists in Taiwan. And then the Chinese would have to build up a big flotilla of thousands and thousands of ships. Remember, it's more than 10 times larger than the flotilla that went across the English Channel. But it's 81 miles they've got to travel. And even in a very fast destroyer, that's an hour and a half or something. With the the fastest smaller boats, then it's nearly 3 hours. With most boats, it would be several hours to travel that distance. So you're going to have a huge flotilla, and they claim, they say, analysts say, not claim, sorry, they say, and they analyse, and they say that it would, the world would know about it 60 days in advance, and they were pretty sure it was about to cross about 30 days in advance. There are only 2 months in the year where it actually makes sense, because a lot of the year there's very high waves, there's strong winds, there's typhoons and things. It's no problem for big destroyers, but remember they've got to have a whole flotilla of lots and lots of smaller ships, each carrying a few tanks, because they could never carry 2.5 million people on their big destroyers. They couldn't just fly a couple of destroyers. They couldn't just sail a couple of destroyers over Taiwan. So they need very good weather to make that crossing, for it to be a sensible thing for them to do. Otherwise, you have lots of seasick sailors and their boats going up and down, and some of them probably sinking in the typhoons and there will be heavy waves and so on. And because they wouldn't be able to use big, huge things like destroyers to carry them all across. Meanwhile, Taiwan has a capable navy of its own, unlike the Ukraine, which doesn't have a capable navy. But Taiwan has got quite a strong navy, not quite as big as the Chinese, but the Chinese aren't even as much as 10 times stronger than Taiwanese. Got quite a strong navy, and Taiwan has got several hundred jets. I think it's got 200 of them in underground hangars near Taipei, which they've actually got an entire underground city, which is just not like, imagine Azovstal. You know how hard it was for China to take Azovstal, and they only eventually took it for Russia to take Azovstal. They only eventually took it because they ran out of provisions. So Taiwan has a very well stocked underground city, full of fuel and parts for its planes, and its jet fighters fly from hangars that are built into the mountain. and they have engineers down there, and they have gas stations to fill their, their planes, and they have miles and miles of roads and shops and everything onto there. Everything they need is down there, some supplies and things, all underground, and it would last them for months. And then they have lorries, trucks, if you're from the United States, with these anti-ship missiles, and you can see how it's all covered in forest. And these would drive around in the forest, and they've only got 14 small invasion beaches, which are overlooked by high skyscrapers that are earthquake resistant. So they're very strong, and some of them overlooked by cliffs or steep hills, mountains, and then as soon as the Taiwan saw this fleet crossing, remember they'd have hours of preparation, an hour and a half for the destroyer, but the destroyer isn't going to go ahead and just arrive in Taiwan. It's going to be staying behind and looking after all the others. And so they've got these ships that can do mine laying very quickly, and they just go all the way around Taiwan and surround it with sea mines. And then they have very fast catamarans with these cruise missiles, and they'd wait for the Chinese ships to get close and take a bit closer. They wouldn't do it straight away. They've changed their tactics. They no longer intend to engage China in the distance. They engage China when it gets close to Taiwan, and they'd send these fast catamarans out, which would then each be equipped with several cruise missiles, which they'd fire at these boats. Imagine you're on and now compare, that is what China has to do. And then once it gets there, it's got these invasion beaches, and they've got the beaches would also be have lots of mines in them, laid in the beaches, and then artillery shooting at the boats as they try to get ashore. And you imagine, remember with Ukraine, then Taiwan did exercise back and forth, and it was just right next to the border, and then just suddenly it drove across the border and went through checkpoints and along the roads, and it had rail, and Russia has railway lines, Russia has railway lines that run from Russia into Taiwan, into Ukraine, I keep saying the wrong words, that goes from Russia into Ukraine. And that's been a key to the Russian, that's how they supply all their munitions to Ukraine. Taiwan would have to supply all its munitions with boats across the sea, or with planes, which is very difficult. Those boats would be sunk. So we would have to carry loads of munitions across, not just the soldiers, many times more weight of munitions than the soldiers. And they would have to carry all that across and keep carrying that across for as long as the war continued, while Taiwan fights back with these these ground-to-ship missiles and ship-to-ship missiles. And their cruise missiles, Taiwan already, it doesn't need support from the United States. It's already more capable now than Ukraine is now, even with all the increase in elevated support. Taiwan is far more capable than Ukraine is. And it's got loads and loads of different cruise missiles and anti-ship missiles. It's all focused on stopping ships as its main focus. And then once they get to Taiwan, then they lay wires across between skyscrapers to stop the helicopters going past. And so if you imagine, for China to get a beachhead on Taiwan, so for Russia it just had to drive over the border. For China, it has to cross this ocean, being faced with an onslaught of cruise missiles, which it can't fire back at easily. You saw how difficult it was to fight back to HIMARS. The trucks would fire and go and fire and go and fire and go. And then there are lots of dummy trucks and lots of dummy planes, so which would be moved around to confuse the Chinese. And the Chinese know that. They know that there are many more dummy targets and dummy artillery placements and so on than there are real ones on Taiwan. So they wouldn't know which are the ones they're supposed to hit. They'd be hitting lots of paper cutouts, basically, or whatever it is they use nowadays for these dummy things, these imitation things. So it's totally beyond credible. There's just no way that China's going to start on a war like this. And so if I look at the people who say that China could fight Taiwan, they don't go into any details. I go into the people who give lots of details, like the ones I've just given, and they say that there's no way that China, some of them even say that Taiwan would win this war. For instance, there was a big article in Foreign Policy, based on a couple of books by people who studied this very carefully, that was just not ambiguous at all. It just said Taiwan will win. Because it's just so difficult for China to invade. And then others sort of, they give very implausible things. They say, well, China is not going to attack the invasion beaches, it's going to try and attack the Taiwanese ports. But that's an incredibly difficult thing to do, because Taiwan, if it gets a beachhead on, if it did get a small beachhead on one of these beaches, one of these 14 small beaches on Taiwan, it then has to supply it. And that beach wouldn't have the resources to get things on board, to load all the munitions and other things that are needed, and the food and the water that an army needs to keep going on Taiwan. So they have those continually going back and forth from China, but they'd need a dock to land them on, or else they don't be just landing a few at a time. From each boat, a boat comes, or offloads a few to crates of munitions, another boat comes, offloads a few. To do it properly, they need cranes. They need a big barge, a big whatever you call them, cargo ships to carry the munitions over to Taiwan, and then big cranes to lift them off. Nobody has fought a war remotely like this in modern times. If you go back to D-Day, that wasn't invading an island, but that's the closest to what we've had to this, but it was a much shorter distance and not modern weapons. There have been other wars since then, but there's been wars, like for instance, United States. Some people mention United States attacking Japan until it surrendered, but that was aerial bombardments in a very, very different situation, and that Taiwan is not going to surrender in a situation like that, and there's no way that the sort of aerial bombardments that Japan did, that the United States did against Japan, is not something that any country is going to do today, because it was carpet bombing. And there's no way China is going to do carpet bombing of Taiwan, because we've moved beyond those days. People just don't do carpet bombing anymore. Even Russia, with all the awful war crimes it's done in Ukraine, has not done proper carpet bombing. It's gradually, using artillery, demolished cities bit by bit. But the proper carpet bombing, especially with firestorms, they could have gone in with a whole wave of bombers on the first day and turned Kharkiv into a firestorm and captured Kharkiv on the first day. We just don't do things like that today. That would have been just so beyond the pale that even Russia doesn't do that. With all the war crimes they've done, they've never come close to doing what the Allies and the United States and Germany did on its side in World War II. They've just not done those sort of atrocities. We don't do them anymore. Back then they weren't seen as war crimes. But we have moved forward in our understanding of human rights, of the rights of civilians, the rights of civilians not to be attacked in wartime, not to be affected by attacks like this on, especially. But we moved forward. If you look at the various conventions, Convention Against Carpet Bombing is quite a long time after World War II, and although not everyone has supported it, not all countries have signed it. In effect, they do follow it. There's very little of that goes on anymore. This is about just the Moskva and how it was sunk by two small Neptune sea-skimming vessels. This is about how Taiwan has several hundred jet fighters that can land on highways and then fly out of these fortified hangars I was talking about. So they can fly out of the hangars and then they can land on the highways and then take off again. Ukraine can do that too, and that leaves nowhere really for China to target. It could target so you've got the hangars from the mountains that open out onto runways. China could try to target those, but the planes can at a pinch fly out of the hangars without using the runways. So even that's not going to work. This is an example of a hangar in where is it? In Sweden. So can see it is quite a wide, it's quite a distinctive shape, curved and big, very wide, and that's for a plane, and quite high for a plane to fly out of. So it would drive out of that and then fly, and then just fly off very quickly into the air. And it would be, the Taiwanese don't seem to have shared photos of their hangars. I think they keep them secret. I'm not sure people do share them. I can't find any copies anywhere. If they do let me know, and I'll add to it. So, so China there's no way. The ships, sitting ducks for anti-ship missiles, jets flying out of underground tunnels, mobile tricks with anti-ship missiles on land, and Russia, unlike Russia, China's almost no war experience. And look how badly Ukraine war went for Russia, which has lots of war experience, but never of such a large war involving combined operations. So it's very difficult to combine the sea, the land, the munitions, the logistics, the tanks, and then the fast-moving support vessel, so those are the three things for land invasion: are the air, the tanks, and then the faster-moving, what they call the brigades. With the sea, then again the air, the sea, and I suppose it would be other fast-moving ships, and then they have the land operations, and it's very difficult to do once they get to Taiwan. How on earth they're going to take all of Taiwan just using equipment they've got to bring over the strait for last them. So so to invade Taiwan, it's probably several orders of magnitude. An order of magnitude means 10 times harder. And it's probably several orders of magnitude. 2 orders of magnitude means 100 times harder. 3 orders of magnitude means 1,000 times harder. And so I don't know whether it's 10 times or 1,000 times harder. It's probably 1,000 times harder. I wouldn't be surprised, but I have no idea how you'd estimate something like that. So so China has to keep bluffing. So why do they bluff? I explained that briefly at the start. It's because the three ways out of this. One, China becomes a democracy. That was the hope for Taiwan before they moved to the new idea of wanting to be independent. They're hoping that eventually, and so the parties in Taiwan that want to be unification eventually with China want it with a democratic China. So their hope is for China eventually become a democracy, and then for Taiwan to join them. Now, China's hope is for Taiwan to become communist, but there are very few there's some very small communist parties in Taiwan. None of the main parties are communist. So the chance of Taiwan becoming communist is just about zero. And then finally, the other possibility is that if China recognized Taiwanese independence, well, it's really China stuck in the past. They're thinking of Taiwan as the exiled government of exiled imperial government. It's the previous imperial government of China. But most in Taiwan don't think of themselves as the exiled imperial government anymore. They've moved forward. So if China was to move on, and I would imagine there's no other resolution of this unless, as I said, those other two things, that Taiwan becomes becomes communist, or China becomes democracy. If you look forward many decades, both of those could be possible, because changes do happen, but none of them look even remotely possible at the present. And so now if you look forward, say, a century from now, when there's nobody left who was even born in that time, then I would imagine that gradually the Chinese would lose the idea, that it would stop thinking about Taiwan as being the exiled imperial government, and the Taiwanese would stop that too, assuming another century of just de facto like this, in this awkward situation. So eventually, probably Taiwan in next century will be independent. And it might happen sooner. So short of those other two, but that third is, I think, seems the most likely at present. There's no other resolution. But meanwhile, China has to keep bluffing, because it is stuck with this idea that Taiwan is the exiled government of China. For as long as China thinks of Taiwan like that, then China has to keep bluffing that it could take over Taiwan, because otherwise it would be delegitimizing its own government in their own eyes. So if they said, Taiwan is the exiled imperial government and it's got a right for independence from China, then that's basically saying that the exiled imperial government is legitimate and is the older government of China, which would be a very awkward situation for China. So the communist Chinese can't really say that. So they have to, if they can move around to stop thinking of Taiwan as the exiled imperial government, then they can move forward and then start thinking about and then start recognizing Taiwanese independence. I don't see any other way out at present. So now why is it so important today? Well, the thing is that, but for start off, China, with its invasion of Hong Kong, undermined its commitment to the one nation, two systems policy in Hong Kong, which is what it was claiming it would eventually have with Taiwan. So it's become clear that Hong Kong is not independent at all. And so that really underlines that China's plans for Taiwan would not be possible with Taiwan as an independent country. And so it's really a reaction to China's taking over of Hong Kong is the reason why the United States, and this started under Trump, not under Biden, for those of you who are Trump fans. So Trump, when he was still candidate, before he became president, had a phone call with the president of Taiwan. So Trump was very much towards recognizing Taiwan. And so Biden is just continuing that policy. And it was under Trump that was a policy of sending diplomats back to Taiwan. And quite a few have been sent, both under Trump and then again under Biden. So the United States is just continuing a long-standing policy now since Trump of sending diplomats. Pelosi is the highest ranking since since the 1969 or whatever it was, but they've sent many diplomats in the last few years, and so they're seen as being very important for supporting Taiwan and its democracy. And some people say, but doing this is going to antagonize China. It's going to mean China might give support to Russia. What this is doing is supporting, from the United States point of view, it's supporting democracy in Taiwan and showing we support democracy everywhere, in Ukraine and in Taiwan. So from China, the United States point of view, they're supporting Ukraine by supporting Taiwan. And they don't see it as different things. Biden didn't authorize this visit. He made it very clear that Pelosi it's an independent branch of government, and Pelosi has the right to make her own decisions about this as being a member of Congress and the three branches of government of the Supreme Court, the Congress and the President, and Pelosi has her own right to make her own decisions. So it wasn't Biden's decision, and it would have been the same if the Speaker of the House was a Republican, then it could have been just the same, because the Republicans have the same attitude towards both Ukraine and Taiwan. It's a lot of bipartisan support for all this. So I think there's no reason to suppose that it was because Pelosi was a Democrat. I think that a Republican Speaker of the House might well have done the same, because this is one issue on which the Republicans are recently aligned with the Biden administration, although they may not make a big thing about it. So it was Newt Gingrich who was talking about, he had lots of bad things to say about Joe Manchin's climate bill, which the Republicans don't like, in that very same interview, that he was supporting Pelosi in her. So he is opposed to Joe Manchin and the climate bill, but he's very much in support of Pelosi going to Taiwan and doing what she's doing. So that's why they had to do it. And don't think of this as having an adverse effect on China's. China's not going to start supporting Russia with weapons. China does not support the Ukraine war. China has reasonable relations with Ukraine. It tries to position itself as a mediator, although a few others think of it in that form. They see it as being too biased towards Russia. But they're not allies. China and Russia often have opposing interests on many topics. They sometimes have aligned interests, like mutual opposition to NATO, but they have opposing interests too. And they've even been at war in the past. And there's no way that China and Russia's been very reluctant to send its military weapons to China, so it's no surprise for China to be reluctant to send its military weapons to Russia as well, the more advanced components. So that was happening anyway. So it's not likely that this is going to lead to China suddenly saying, oh well, we're going to send advanced drones or something to Russia. That's not a likely scenario from this. So, and being strong about this with China, I think if anything, leads to the United States being strong with the US, with China about Ukraine too. So I don't see, some people talk about this being, is there a downside for Ukraine? I don't see how there is. I've heard people saying both sides of the thing. When looking at what people say about this, I don't see how there's a downside for Ukraine on this either. I think by supporting democracy, Pelosi is supporting, by supporting Taiwan, Pelosi is supporting democracy. And I think that's how they see it. And is supporting Ukraine and helping Ukraine in its fight too. And indeed, the United States is learning from the Ukraine war many lessons that will be very useful for Taiwan, which might well be something that Pelosi will be talking about with Taiwan, about how to defend themselves based on what they've learned from the Ukraine war. Or some of the people who go with her to Taiwan in secret meetings, they may well be talking about things like that. So the United States has been trying to encourage Taiwan to take more interest in the kind of smaller unmanned drones and things. And Taiwan, though, has a different situation from Ukraine because of the big sea, so it's a different situation. So I expect they'll have quite a lot of discussion about things like that and the lessons from Ukraine for Taiwan, and indeed Taiwan's lessons for Ukraine. So there may be some of that going on as well as part of this visit. I wouldn't be surprised if this is partly a military and chance for military experts to talk to each other and learning from Taiwan and Taiwan from the United States and Ukraine. So, as I said, China has a very strong focus on soft power and improving China's image, and especially since the end of the Cold War. China has been one of the enthusiast adopters of the term soft power. And you see lots of China articles coming out, thousands and thousands of articles on Chinese soft power. The academics in China write huge, vast amounts about soft power. And it's got a much broader idea of soft power than the United States have. That's neither there. It's not necessarily, it's not just cultural values and foreign policy, but also their technical innovation, the economic governance, their political capacity building and mobilization, many other things. So that's culture is emphasized as part of a vast complex. So China, think about how great they are, and they are in some ways. Some of the things they're doing are really amazing. So there are things we can learn from each other, while at the same time being very saying. So, and in my view, the health workers in China and their COVID response was something extraordinary that the world's never seen before. The way they stopped COVID. I've talked about that before. And a few other countries have been able to do it. And they didn't do it by authoritarian methods. It was anyway, I've talked about that many times before. So when you say things like that, and then you look at what they've done with renewables, they've made extraordinary advances in renewables, and the whole world is benefiting from that. So vast. It's over 150 gigawatts of solar power going to be added to the Chinese grid this year. It's the most they've ever added, far more than any other country has ever added. And it's increasing more and more. And as a result of China's big boost on renewables, China is reduced the price of renewables and everyone else has to compete with that. And it's part of the reason why there's been such a rapid fall in the cost of renewables, is because of China's big push. So while we continue to be very strong on China for its human rights violations, for its sometimes not very ethical practices when it's dealing with other countries and so on, we should also recognise what they do well and learn from what it does, what they do well. And I think if we do that, if we have these two things, indeed the West could do with a bit more soft power of kind of recognising and more dialogue, and then looking at what China does well, but at the same time not hesitating to and you actually, by building bridges with ordinary people in China, by looking at what they're doing well, and the ordinary kind people in China, there are lots of good people in China, of course there are in every country, and by building bridges to those people, then we can help lead to a less militarized future. We can help with disarmament, nuclear disarmament. We can help with so when countries are appreciated for one thing, then it opens you avenues to then have other things that you can talk about. And eventually, if we eventually get independence of Taiwan, I don't see any other future here except eventually independence of Taiwan, then it's dialogue like that. So being strong as well though, so not letting yourself be bullied, but recognizing positives in each other, and this is really our way forward. And then so for yourself, if you are getting your problems and getting scared about all this stuff, remember that there are vast numbers of kind people in every country in the world. There are billions of kind people in the world, and just about everyone is kind at some of the time, and most people are kind most of the time. So there's a vast amount of kindness in Taiwan, in China, in Russia, in the United States, in Europe, in the EU, in South America, Asia, everywhere. And so we can help build bridges with all these kind people around the world. And in that way we can lead to a more peaceful future. And it's my personal belief that extraterrestrials, that we're just in a phase and looking at the way that humans are going to have more respect of human rights and more and in the direction of more wars but less casualties in the wars, and generally finished more quickly, and the more wars are mainly because there are more countries, and much less of the big civilian casualties figures that we used to have in the 20th century. And then you look back to earlier, if you look back to the 19th century, they didn't have the capability to kill so many people at once, but they had much less respect for human rights. They didn't even respect hospitals and didn't even respect medical care on the battlefield in the 19th century, early 19th century. So if you go going back, there's far less respect for human rights the further back you go. So that's the direction we're going. And respect for, if you go back to, say, the passenger pigeons, nobody even gave a thought to preserving until really towards the end when it became too late. And that will never happen again. So some species still going extinct, but we're doing a huge amount in preserving, reversing the loss of biodiversity. And we can't make most species unextinct, but we can stop the loss of biodiversity around the world and reverse it, and places become more biodiverse. That's going on. So we are heading for a future of more biorespect, less violent, more respect for human rights, not without competition. Things like space race, things like the Olympics, we can have competition without killing people. And I think, and then a future, there's no reason why we should have a future with famine. I think that a civilized extraterrestrial looking at Earth as it is now would look at us and say, well, they've got a ways to go. They've still got people dying of hunger. They're still killing each other in wars. They're sort of just a little bit beyond they learnt fire, a few thousand years ago. They've learnt agriculture a little bit beyond the Stone Age, and they've just gotten basically they've got the computer chips, but they wouldn't be much impressed by that. They'd probably move forward to some kind of technology where you can't even see it, where it's just maybe they grow plants that can do anything they like or something. Things like, to us, would just seem like plants. You just plant a seed and up grows a house or something. Who knows what future technology will be like. I don't think they would be impressed by our computers or our missiles. They'd be like stones and arrows. So I think an extraterrestrial civilization looking at us would think of us being, for them, it would be they're past 1 million years ago, because it's very unlikely we meet an extraterrestrial that has happened to develop at the same level as us. So if we do meet an extraterrestrial, chances are they've been civilized for 1 million years, probably longer, hundreds of thousands. Very unlikely it's less than hundreds of thousands. So they'd look at us and they'd say, well, they're a very early stage of their civilization. They've still got people dying of hunger. They still haven't got, medicine for everyone. The advanced medicines they're still struggling with that. They're still, they're still killing people in wars. They haven't yet figured out other ways of dealing with differences of view. Not very well, but look, it's quite promising. They're working together on climate change. They've worked together on the ozone layer. They have developed some human rights legislation. They have moved significantly past the Stone Age, and they're just on the point of starting to become moderately civilized. I think that's how an extraterrestrial will look at us. And so I think there's a good chance that in the future, I don't think it's going to be very many centuries before we see an end to warfare. But for now, then it does still happen, but there's an awful lot of bluffing and an awful lot of diplomacy, and there's much more of that than there's any actual combat in our modern world. I think that's going to continue happening more and more, and then gradually move to a more peaceful world. At least that's the trajectory. And Carl Sagan thought that was quite a long time ago. He saw us as moving towards peace as he saw that direction as well, quite a few decades ago. And he is of the view that the reason we don't see extraterrestrials here is because they have this sustainable future, just like us. If you are a sustainable future, then you have minimal impact on the galaxy, and so you'd be almost invisible to other civilizations in the galaxy, not because you're hiding, but because you have biorespect. You don't want to, you don't need to turn the galaxy into a copy of yourself, and you're stable in your own, you are confident in your own abilities, your own civilization, your own culture, and you don't need to prove yourself to anyone. You don't need to try and turn everything into copies of yourself. And I think that's where we're headed. And anyway, this is going on rather. So I will stop this and upload it, and hope some of you will be a little bit less scared as a result of this video.